June 25, 1876. The Little Bighorn River ran high that summer. The air shimmered with heat, and somewhere along its winding banks, a small detail was missed. A detail that might rewrite everything we thought we knew about Custer's last stand. For nearly a century and a half, this battle has stood as a symbol of the American frontier. Bravery, arrogance, destiny, and defeat. It has been painted on canvas, retold in classrooms, dramatized in films. Custer's fall became a myth, a story about pride, a monument to the end of an age. But behind every myth, there is a quieter truth, and sometimes that truth is not found in the gunfire or the glory. It waits in the land itself. America in 1876 was celebrating its 100th year of independence. The railroads reached farther west each day. The frontier was shrinking. Ambition collided with resistance. And in the rolling hills of Montana, those two forces finally met. We all know the story. Custer outnumbered, surrounded, cut down by the warriors of the Lakota and Cheyenne. A fatal mistake. A last stand carved into legend. But what if the story we know isn't complete? What if Custer didn't lose only because of arrogance or numbers? What if he lost because of nature itself? Because sometimes the land remembers what history forgets. And sometimes the smallest feature of that land decides the fate of everything upon it. This is the story of that forgotten detail. For generations, we were told that Little Bighorn was a dry, windswept valley, a place of dust, heat, and hard earth. Every painting, every textbook, every reenactment repeated the same story. A barren gulch, empty of water and life, where two worlds clashed beneath a burning sky. That image became history. It shaped how we imagined the fight, how we judged Custer, and how we measured defeat. But it was never questioned. Because sometimes when a story fits the legend, no one looks too closely at the ground beneath it. The truth is more complicated. When early cartographers arrived to map the field, weeks had already passed. The summer floodwaters had dropped. The river that once ran wide and heavy had shrunk back into its narrow channel. What they saw was not what the soldiers saw. They drew a landscape that no longer existed. Survivors gave their accounts, but none of them matched. Major Reno described dry ravines. Captain Benteen spoke of swampy stretches near the river. Others mentioned thick grass and muddy soil. Each man saw only the piece of the field he survived. And so a single image, the dry gulch, became the easy truth to print. Early historians accepted it. They cared about heroism and failure, not hydrology. They studied tactics, not terrain. The river and its wetlands were treated as background, not as part of the story. And slowly, the land's voice was forgotten. Old photographs and topographic maps from the U.S. Army tell a different story. Shadows of water channels, depressions in the earth. Signs of a place that once held more than dust. A battlefield shaped not by dryness, but by the movement of water. So we have to ask, was the dry gulch ever truly dry? Or have we been walking across a myth for nearly 150 years? For more than 100 years, historians walked the field of Little Bighorn and saw nothing unusual. Rolling hills, a winding river, open grass. But hidden in the earliest survey notes, there was something small. Something everyone missed. In 1877, a U.S. Army engineer recorded a curious detail, a line of debris and packed soil stretching across a shallow bend of the river. He called it a beaver dam. 4 years later, in 1881, another team mentioned it again. Then it disappeared from the record. For the next century, no one spoke of it. It was too small to matter, too ordinary to question. But what if that small, ordinary thing wasn't ordinary at all? In the oral histories of the Crow and the Lakota, the land is remembered differently. They spoke of marshland near the water, tall reeds swaying in the wind, a place where horses sank to their knees in soft mud, a place that slowed everything that entered it. Those words sat quietly in archives for decades, dismissed as poetic memory, not physical evidence. But the people who lived here knew the land better than anyone. They knew when the river ran high. They knew when it flooded. And they remembered when the ground turned against the men who rode into it. If a large beaver dam once stood along that stretch of the Little Bighorn, it could have changed everything. It would have backed up the water, spread it wide into the low ground, turned dry soil into a boggy trap, and forced Custer's cavalry to find another way through. Imagine it. A commander looking across what seemed like a narrow stream. The surface calm, the crossing easy, but beneath it lay a flooded basin, soft and treacherous. Custer may have thought he was crossing a shallow tributary. He had no idea the land itself had been reshaped by nature's own engineers. A wall of water mud and time, built by beavers, ignored by men, and possibly the very thing that sealed his fate. For decades, the story stayed dry. Textbooks, tours, and museum displays all described the same terrain: hard ground, shallow gullies, open hills. But in the early 2000s, science began to look closer, and what it found did not match the legend. When archaeologists returned to the Little Bighorn, they came with new tools. Sediment cores taken from the lower valley told a quiet but powerful story. Layer after layer of fine silt, traces of algae and trapped pollen, the signature of standing water that had once covered the land. It was physical proof that the dry gulch had in fact been a wetland. LiDAR and GIS mapping brought the landscape back to life in 3 dimensions. From above, the contours revealed a shallow depression shaped like a bowl, exactly where the old surveys had hinted at a beaver dam. That bowl, that low shelf, could only have formed by pooled water, a pond that flooded and retreated over many years. The evidence kept building. Archaeologists Richard Fox and Douglas Scott began mapping the battlefield using ballistic forensics. They plotted thousands of cartridge casings found across the ridges and slopes. Each casing marked where a soldier fired his weapon or where a warrior returned fire. Together, those points created patterns, lines of movement frozen in the dirt. What they saw was striking. The densest clusters of ammunition and the heaviest casualties were found not on the high ridges, but in the low basin near the river. The very place that, according to new hydrological data, would have been waterlogged. It meant that Custer's men were not fighting from a dry rise. They were trapped in soft, wet ground. Their horses struggled. Their gunpowder fouled. Their range shortened. The myth of the dry gulch began to crumble, and with it, one of the most persistent images in American history. The past, it turns out, was wetter than anyone thought. By the summer of 1876, George Armstrong Custer was still chasing glory. He had been warned not to underestimate the enemy. But when his scouts spotted a massive native encampment along the Little Bighorn, he made a decision that would shape his legacy forever. Custer divided his regiment into 3 wings. His plan was simple: approach the Lakota and Cheyenne village from multiple directions, cut off their escape, crush them before they could scatter. It was a bold idea, but the land had other plans. If the Beaver Dam truly existed, it changed everything. The southern approach that Custer intended to use was no longer open ground. It was flooded, soft, and slow. A natural barrier that forced him to veer north and climb the ridges above the river. That detour cost him time, and in battle time is everything. The terrain betrayed him in more ways than one. The wet ground swallowed the cavalry's speed. Horses sank deep with every step. Formations broke apart. What should have been a coordinated strike turned into scattered movements across uneven hills. Each company lost sight of the others. Orders failed to reach their targets, and communication dissolved into chaos. One of his officers later said quietly, "He trusted his eyes more than his scouts." Custer looked at the land and thought he understood it. He believed what he saw. A shallow river, firm banks, clear paths. But the truth lay just beneath the surface. The water had reshaped the ground. The soil was deceptive. What looked solid was not. And what seemed like a route forward was in fact a trap. History often calls Custer reckless, arrogant, a man blinded by pride. But perhaps he was something else. A commander betrayed by the very ground beneath him. A soldier undone not only by his choices, but by the quiet power of nature itself. For the Lakota, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho, the Little Bighorn was never just a battlefield. It was a living place, a place where the river carried memory and the hills listened. They called it spirit water, and they said that on that day the land itself spoke. Generations later, their stories still flow like the river that shaped them. In the old songs and oral histories, the elders spoke of soft ground near the river. They said the soldiers' horses were trapped in wet soil. They said their hooves sank, their riders dismounted, their lines fell apart. And they remembered how the water turned against the intruders who did not understand it. One elder described it simply. The river was not the only thing flowing that day. It was the land itself moving beneath their feet, shifting, resisting, remembering. For years, historians dismissed these accounts as legend, not record. They treated them as symbols, not facts. But today, science has begun to confirm what these people already knew. The sediment cores, the depressions, the traces of long-standing water all align with what the tribes remembered. A wet and obstructed landscape. A place that swallowed horses and slowed men. A terrain that belonged to those who listened to it. To understand the battle, you must first understand the land. It was never only about weapons and numbers. It was about awareness. Those who lived with the river knew when it flooded. They knew where the ground softened. They knew how to move with the flow, not against it. While soldiers saw strategy, the tribes saw balance. Where one side fought the earth, the other walked with it. And on that day, the land chose who it would remember. For more than a century, the map of Little Bighorn seemed fixed. Lines drawn in textbooks, arrows showing cavalry charges and counterattacks. But when scientists rebuilt the landscape in 3 dimensions, the map began to change. The battle looked different. The truth shifted just as the river once did. The new topography revealed a hidden shape beneath the myth. A wide basin where water once pooled. The same basin that separated Custer's men from their reinforcements. While Major Reno and Captain Benteen fought miles away, Custer's battalion found itself cut off by the flooded ground. What looked like open space was actually a barrier, a shallow lake of mud and reeds standing between one wing of the regiment and the other. To the men on horseback, it must have felt like a maum. Custer could see Reno's smoke in the distance, but the route toward him was broken by Watir. Every detour led to higher ridges, rougher climbs, and slower movement. What should have been a single coordinated strike became 3 separate fights scattered across uneven ground. The native warriors saw the same landscape differently. They knew its rhythms. They moved along the western ridges, staying on solid earth, while the soldiers floundered below. They used the rising ground to close in, tightening the circle around Custer's trapped companies. By the time he realized the danger, the ridges around him were alive with riders. Modern reconstructions show it clearly. Without the dam and the flooded basin, Custer might have crossed farther south. He might have joined Reno and Benteen, combining his forces before the village could react. The outcome might have changed. The disaster might have been delayed, or perhaps avoided entirely. It leads to one haunting question. Was it arrogance that doomed him, miscommunication? Or was it something deeper, something beneath his boots and his horse's hooves? Was it geography itself that sealed his fate? For nearly a century and a half, no one spoke of the Beaver Dam again. The reports from 1877 and 1881 sat in dusty archives, unread, unnoticed. The maps were copied, the myths were told, and the story hardened into legend. What had once been a small observation was erased by time and by the way history was written. History has always been shaped by the hands that tell it. The early chroniclers of Little Bighorn were soldiers, journalists, and romantic storytellers. They focused on courage and tragedy, on Custer's bravery on the final stand on the fall of the 7th Cavalry. They wrote about men, not about land. They searched for meaning in heroism, not in hydrology. And the environment, the very thing that shaped the battle, disappeared from the page. Military historians of the 19th century had no tools to study terrain as science does today. They saw landscape as a backdrop, not a participant. They could measure distance, but not the shifting of water. They could count bullets, but not sediment. The earth itself, silent and patient, was left out of the story. The romantic image of the last stand left no space for mud or uncertainty. It demanded clear heroes and clear villains. It wanted drama, not data. And so the Beaver Dam and its quiet influence faded into the background of myth. Only recently have new disciplines begun to fill in the missing pieces. Archaeology, hydrology, and Indigenous studies have joined forces to read the land again. They are uncovering what was ignored, reconnecting human memory with natural evidence. Together, they are restoring context that was lost for generations. The Beaver Dam was never just a structure of wood and mud. It was a reminder that history is not only written in books or carved in stone. It is also written in the soil, in the shape of rivers, and in the silence between them. And when we learn to listen to that silence, the story of Little Bighorn changes once again.